Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Stories for Sinister Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. It started with silence, not a scream, not a gunshot, just absence, one missed court appearance, one unanswered call. Then bags started washing up in the river. Dozens. Inside them, pieces of a man who was never supposed to leave. This is the story of Rita Glusman, and the husband who didn't survive her version of love. On the morning of April 8, 1996, Yakov Glusman's desk at ECI Technology sat empty. His badge hadn't scanned the building's entrance since Friday. That was unusual. Yakov wasn't the type to miss a workday, especially not without notice. He was known for his punctuality, his tight control of schedules, and his distrust of uncertainty. He didn't do unreachable. That morning, his colleagues called his home in Pearl River, a suburban pocket of Rockland County, New York. No answer. They tried again. Still nothing. At first, there was speculation. Maybe a family emergency, maybe something related to his ongoing divorce proceedings. But by midday, one of the managers grew concerned enough to drive to the Glusman residence. The car was there, the porch light was still on, nothing looked forced or broken. Still, no one answered the door. By early evening, a wellness check was requested. Officers from Orangetown PD arrived around 6:40 p.m. They knocked several times. No response. Through the front window, they could see a kitchen light on. No movement. They walked around the property, back door locked, garbage cans empty. The car in the driveway hadn't moved in at least 2 days, confirmed by a thin layer of pollen along the windshield. There was no sign of struggle, but something wasn't right. The officers obtained authorization to enter. The house was quiet, too quiet. Inside, they found a half-eaten plate of food on the counter, with utensils neatly placed beside it. A microwave blinking 2:11 a.m., power still active, suggesting that was the last input. A damp towel in the bathroom. No signs of forced entry. No Yakov. They swept the home. No blood. No overturned furniture. No smashed glass. Everything was intact, which is exactly what disturbed the lead officer on scene. As he later told investigators, "We've seen messier disappearances. This one looked like it had been wiped clean, and I don't mean with bleach, I mean emotionally clean. Cold." When they reached the master bedroom, they noted a few items missing. One suitcase, possibly packed intentionally, but Yakov's wallet, keys, and watch were still on the dresser. His work ID lay untouched beside a jar of coins. That detail stuck out. Yakov never left without his badge. In the garage, nothing out of place. Tools hung on a pegboard. Lawn equipment lined the side. A storage cabinet was sealed, locked with a chain. Police didn't have cause to cut it open yet. But a notation was made. Uninspected metal storage, approximately 3.5 feet wide, locked. That night, a bolo, be on the lookout, was filed for Yakov Glusman. His photo, a headshot from his corporate ID, was uploaded into the statewide system. His cell phone was inactive. Landline at the house had no voicemail activity. He hadn't used his ATM or credit card since April 5th. And there was something else. A family court hearing had been scheduled for that very morning. Yakov was set to appear for a status update in the divorce case he'd initiated against his wife, Rita Glusman. He never showed. Neither did Rita. Court records showed she had also failed to file a required financial affidavit due that day. Her attorney claimed she hadn't returned calls over the weekend. It wasn't just one person missing anymore. Police began mapping timelines. The last confirmed sighting of Yakov was Friday, April 5th. A coworker saw him leave the ECI parking lot around 6:15 p.m. Surveillance footage confirmed the car pulling out. Normal departure. No signs of distress. A neighbor remembered hearing what he thought was a faint knocking the following night, Saturday, but dismissed it. Another mentioned hearing a vehicle start up early Sunday before sunrise, but couldn't say who it belonged to. There were no security cameras on the property, no Ring doorbells. This was 1996. The most promising detail came from Yakov's workplace. His assistant mentioned that Yakov had been unusually agitated the week before. Not angry, just distracted. He had mentioned a complicated meeting with his soon-to-be ex-wife and noted that he was handling things quietly. When asked what that meant, he simply replied, "It'll be over soon." A chilling phrase in retrospect. By April 9th, Yakov was classified as an endangered missing adult. Given the pending divorce, officers attempted contact with Rita again. They visited her listed residence in Belleville, New Jersey. She wasn't there. Her vehicle was also gone. No activity on her bank cards. No recent calls on her landline. Her cell phone, registered under Yakov's name, had been inactive since Saturday morning. Police formally expanded the missing persons investigation to cover both states. As this initial investigation was unfolding, evidence was still thin. No forced entry, no calls to 911, no blood, no witness statements of a struggle, and no solid reason to classify it as foul play, yet. But to detectives, the absence of evidence was evidence. No one vanishes without leaving something behind, not in the middle of a court battle, not with his work badge, his wallet, and his phone sitting untouched. The house was too clean, the timing was too exact, the silence was too long. There was one more detail that quietly unsettled investigators. Yakov had a scheduled deposition on April 10th, part of the divorce proceedings. It was where he was expected to provide financial disclosures. He had never missed a legal appointment in his life. Now he was missing everything. Pearl River PD handed off the initial case file on April 9th to the Rockland County Major Crimes Unit. At this point, Yakov Gluzman was still officially listed as missing. But the file didn't feel like a missing persons case. It read like the beginning of something colder, something concealed. Lead investigator Frank Messina, with over 17 years of homicide experience, reviewed the report that night. His first comment wasn't about evidence, it was about timing. When people disappear during litigation, especially divorce, it's rarely coincidence. It's a fuse. At the center of that fuse was the woman Yakov had spent over 2 decades trying to hold a life together with. Rita Gluzman. She wasn't just absent. She was silent. Her legal counsel hadn't spoken to her since Friday. Her known residence in Belleville, New Jersey, appeared untouched. Neighbors hadn't seen her vehicle. Her mail had begun to accumulate. Phone records showed no outgoing calls. Her court-mandated financial disclosures remained unsigned. Messina requested her file. What came back was a 47-page summary of a complex immigration past, Cold War-era activism, and a steep descent from idealism into legal warfare. Rita Gluzman was born in Ukraine, a Jewish refusnik during the height of Soviet repression. In the early 1980s, she'd been a vocal advocate for family reunification, successfully lobbying for Yakov's mother to emigrate from the USSR to the United States. She once organized demonstrations outside the Soviet embassy. In many ways, she was the kind of woman headlines admired, resolute, sharp, calculated. But the Rita that neighbors knew in Belleville had become something else entirely. They described her as meticulous, almost to the point of obsession. She controlled every bill, every item in the house. One former friend said Rita once insisted her husband submit all grocery receipts directly to her, and she logged them in a spiral-bound ledger. Not for budgeting, for monitoring. Yakov, by contrast, was private and understated. His background was in electrochemical engineering. He worked long hours and rarely socialized. Friends said he tolerated Rita's intensity until it started to feel like surveillance. Divorce papers filed 3 months prior painted a darker portrait. Yakov accused Rita of tapping his landline, opening his mail, and following him to work. He told his attorney he had collected audio recordings, tapes of arguments and threats which he had kept in a fireproof box at his office. That box, when located, contained 6 cassette tapes, each labeled by date. Investigators began transcription. The audio was clean. No physical threats were made, but there were repeated statements from Rita accusing Yakov of betrayal, of infidelity, of humiliation. One quote stood out. "If you think you can leave me and be okay, you're wrong." No legal action had been taken regarding those recordings. But their tone helped frame a motive, not as solid evidence, but as psychological context. The next step was digital. Though this was 1996 and technology was limited, Yakov's computer was intact. His ECI-issued laptop was clean, mostly technical files and spreadsheets, but his home desktop had been opened days prior. Investigators recovered recent WordPerfect files containing notes about bank accounts, life insurance policies, and a pending asset split. One document was particularly important, a handwritten inventory of shared assets. It listed 2 vehicles, 1 IRA, and the Pearl River house. At the bottom of the list, scrawled in a different font, were the words, "If anything happens to me, speak to Mr. Galen at ECI." Mr. Galen was Yakov's supervisor. When questioned, he said Yakov had recently approached him, requesting the company archive his voicemail messages and emails in case anything went missing. Galen had granted that request. This didn't look like paranoia. It looked like preparation. That same day, Messina authorized a request for Rita's purchase history from a local hardware chain in Belleville. Sales records, printed on dot matrix paper, revealed that on April 5th a purchase had been made under her name: 1 24-inch axe, 1 smaller hand hatchet, a roll of contractor-grade duct tape, heavy-duty plastic bags, latex gloves. The clerk remembered the customer clearly. She asked if the bags were strong enough for yard debris, but she didn't look like someone who touched dirt. Still, possession of tools doesn't constitute a crime. Not yet. Investigators now had a pattern: a missing husband, a missing wife, divorce tensions, pre-incident asset documentation, audio recordings suggesting control and escalating frustration, a purchase of tools commonly used in dismemberment. But still, no crime scene, no blood, no body. As Messina wrote in his progress memo, "We're stacking probabilities, not proof. The data aligns too cleanly." Sometimes that's the problem. When people plan a crime, they leave gaps. When they try to erase something, the silence becomes the evidence. Before the end of April 9th, one more lead emerged. A local Belleville resident, a retired postal worker, had called in a tip. He reported seeing a white sedan, possibly a Ford Escort, parked at a nearby industrial lot for 2 nights in a row. The vehicle had no commercial markings and was partially covered by a tarp. Officers arrived the following morning. The car was gone, but a partial oil drip and tire tracks remained. Photos were taken, residue was lifted, and a regional alert was issued for a white Ford Escort, registered, according to DMV data, to one Vladimir Zelenin. At that time, he was listed as a second cousin of Rita Gluzman. But until this point, his name had not appeared in the case file. That was about to change. April 10th, 1996. Passaic River, New Jersey. At 7:38 a.m., a call came into the Belleville Police Department from a local fisherman reporting something heavy and unusual caught on his line while casting from the bank near River Road. He told dispatchers it felt like a mattress or rubber material. When he reeled it in, it tore open, and what he saw wasn't trash. First responders located the object less than 40 yards downstream. A large black contractor bag, half submerged, partially ripped open. Inside was a human foot, pale, stiff, still wearing a sock. Over the next 6 hours, law enforcement from Essex County and Rockland County coordinated a multi-unit river recovery effort. Local divers entered the water with dry suits and sonar support. By 3 p.m., 14 more bags had been located within a 1-mile stretch. Every bag was tied the same way, double knotted with industrial-grade duct tape. Some were weighted with cinder blocks. Others had been partially torn by water movement and exposed their contents: limbs, torso sections, internal organs. The forensic team identified over 60 individual pieces spread across 21 separate bags by day's end. By 9 p.m., it was no longer a missing persons case. It was confirmed homicide. The remains were transported to the New Jersey State Medical Examiner's office in Newark for full forensic analysis. Initial findings were clear. The remains belonged to one individual, male, white, approximately 5'10", middle-aged. Hands were removed cleanly at the wrist joints. Head was missing. Several body parts showed parallel incisions consistent with repeated strikes, suggesting use of a bladed instrument with considerable force. Defensive wounds were absent. Duct tape on all bags was consistent in adhesive pattern, indicating it likely came from a single roll. No external fibers, hairs, or foreign DNA found outside the victim's own. Dental records were ordered. By April 11th, using an upper molar with a prior gold crown, the remains were positively identified as Yakov Gluzman, age 48. Forensic sequencing placed time of death between the late hours of April 5th and early morning of April 6th. That aligned with what detectives had already noted. Yakov was last seen leaving work on April 5th at 6:15 p.m. His microwave at home blinked 2:11 a.m. the only digital clock reset, since it wasn't just that Yakov had been killed, he had been disassembled with precision. There was no clear evidence of animal interference, no evidence of panic in how the parts were handled. According to lead pathologist Dr. Eleanor Ross, this was not rage. This was procedure. Whoever did this didn't hesitate. Investigators now had their victim, but they still didn't have a crime scene. That presented a significant complication. The home had already been processed once under a welfare check warrant. Without visible blood or cause for immediate re-entry, it hadn't been treated as a primary crime scene. That would now change. The original forensic team returned to the Pearl River residence the morning of April 12th with a homicide warrant in hand. This time, they brought luminol kits, trace DNA swabs, and subfloor imaging tools. And that's when they found it. Beneath the washing machine, moved aside during a full appliance sweep, was a half-inch droplet dried into the baseboard. Luminol revealed a trail running behind the machine and across the adjacent vinyl flooring. A preliminary phenolphthalein test was positive for blood. DNA sequencing later confirmed it belonged to Yakov Gluzman. That was the first trace of physical evidence inside the house. It was small, but it was enough. Investigators also revisited the locked metal cabinet in the garage, noted in the initial sweep. This time, they forced it open. Inside were two axes, one standard, 24 inches in length, the other, a smaller hand hatchet. Both had been washed. Both had faint particulate matter embedded in the metal seams. Under forensic light, the smaller blade still carried minute traces of reddish-brown residue in the grip grooves. Lab analysis later confirmed the residue matched human tissue, DNA, again identified as Yakov Gluzman. There were no fingerprints. Both tools had been wiped clean. No gloves were recovered from the house. As more evidence emerged, detectives turned their attention to transportation vectors. How had the body, cut into dozens of pieces, been moved from New York to New Jersey without being seen? That's when they received a surveillance hit. A white 1991 Ford Escort, matching the partial description given by a witness earlier, had been spotted twice on municipal street cams near the Passaic River between April 7th and 9th. The plate returned to Vladimir Zelenin, resident of Belleville, NJ. Zelenin was a 33-year-old cousin of Rita Gluzman. He had no prior criminal record, no flagged financials, and no prior connection to Yakov, other than by marriage. According to DMV records, the Escort had passed emissions 6 months earlier. That meant it had been road active. Detectives visited Zelenin's residence on April 13th. He wasn't home, but the Ford Escort was parked out front under a fabric cover. A search warrant was issued the same afternoon. When investigators entered the vehicle, the first thing they noticed was the smell, chemical, artificial. The seats had been recently scrubbed and several panels were missing. The rear floor mats were gone. Trunk liner had been removed and replaced with cardboard. A canister of industrial cleaner sat in the back seat, but it was what was left behind that mattered. Beneath the cardboard, in the seam of the trunk hinge, lab techs recovered a hair follicle. It was black, short, and matched the mitochondrial DNA profile of Yakov Gluzman. The case had officially crossed state lines. From that point forward, federal jurisdiction was triggered under interstate homicide statutes. The Department of Justice began its early assessments, and within 24 hours, the Violence Against Women Act was cited as a prosecutorial framework due to the marital status between victim and primary person of interest. By April 14th, Yakov's death was confirmed as homicide by blunt force trauma, with post-mortem dismemberment conducted using 2 types of edged weapons. No head was ever recovered. And still, Rita Gluzman had not been located. By the afternoon of April 14th, 1996, the case had shifted. What began as a quiet disappearance was now undeniably a federal homicide. Yakov Gluzman was dead. His remains had been dismembered, sealed in heavy-duty plastic bags, and scattered across the Passaic River. Trace biological evidence had been found in his Pearl River home. The weapons, an axe and a hatchet, had been recovered from a locked garage cabinet, and a white 1991 Ford Escort had surfaced on street cameras near the disposal site. The vehicle belonged to Vladimir Zelenin. Until that point, his name had not appeared in any document connected to Yakov. He wasn't listed on financial statements, legal filings, or even as a witness. The only known link was family. He was Rita Gluzman's cousin, a distant one. Investigators moved quickly. Zelenin had no known job, no active tax filings for the prior year, and no known social ties to Yakov. But he had motive adjacency, proximity to Rita. Detectives from the Rockland County Major Crimes Unit, working jointly with Essex County and federal agents, tracked Zelenin to a basement apartment in Belleville. At 5:42 p.m., a tactical team secured the perimeter. Zelenin was inside, cooperative, and, according to the report, visibly anxious. He didn't ask why they were there. He asked if she was okay. When questioned at the station, Zelenin initially denied knowing anything about Yakov's disappearance. He said he had not been in New York for over a month, but that statement collapsed within the hour. Fingerprints recovered from a roll of duct tape in the Glusman garage matched Zelenin's. Surveillance footage showed his vehicle crossing the George Washington Bridge into New York during the early hours of April 6th. The timestamps aligned with the probable time of Yakov's death. The car's interior had tested positive for Yakov's mitochondrial DNA. There were no other occupants captured on camera, only Zelenin, at 2:13 a.m. On April 15th, after 12 hours in custody, Zelenin revised his statement. He now admitted to being inside the Pearl River residence on the night Yakov vanished. He stated that he had accompanied Rita there to talk. According to his version, Yakov got angry and a struggle occurred. He claimed Rita struck first with the axe, then ordered him to help clean it up. But the timeline didn't match. Forensic analysis estimated Yakov was killed sometime after 2 o'clock a.m. The microwave clock had been blinking that exact time. Neighbors hadn't reported hearing a struggle. No signs of forced entry had been observed. Most critically, the condition of the remains showed no signs of panic or haste. They had been cut with consistent spacing using 2 distinct tools. The process took time, a lot of it, that suggested planning, not reaction. Zelenin continued to claim he had no role in the dismemberment, only in bagging what was already done. But his fingerprints weren't just on the tape. They were on 2 trash bags, on the outer handles of the axe, and on the inside trunk lid of his own car. He had touched every part of the crime. Still, the federal prosecutors needed to decide how to use him. In New York, conviction under state law requires corroboration beyond the testimony of an accomplice. But this wasn't a state case anymore. With the body crossing state lines and the relationship between Yakov and Rita meeting the criteria of intimate partner homicide, the Violence Against Women Act could now be applied. Under federal statute, accomplice testimony can be weighed differently, especially if supported by physical evidence. Zelenin was now both a suspect and a potential witness. To leverage that, the U.S. Dallas Attorney's Office made a calculated decision: offer a limited cooperation agreement. In exchange for full testimony against the principal suspect, he would face 1 count of interstate conspiracy to commit murder, capped at 25 years. On April 16th, Zelenin signed the agreement. Within 48 hours, his statement expanded. He now admitted to being involved in planning Yakov's death. He claimed Rita had told him, weeks earlier, that Yakov was ruining her life, that if she didn't act, she would lose everything. She asked him to buy tools, to keep his car available, and to help transport garbage across the bridge. He admitted to purchasing the trash bags and duct tape. He admitted to helping move Yakov's body into the bathroom. He described the sound of the axe striking bone. He said nothing about remorse. But Zelenin's cooperation raised a new challenge for investigators. How reliable was his account? Parts of his timeline didn't align. He placed events hours earlier than the autopsy suggested. He omitted the location of the victim's head, which had not been found. He failed to explain the removal of organs that had been wrapped separately in the bags. And when asked about the missing gloves, he claimed they must have been thrown away, but couldn't specify when. His account was useful, but it wasn't complete. Detective Frank Messina noted this in his field memo that day. Zelenin talks like a man who wants the sentence, not the truth. What he's leaving out may matter more than what he's saying. Still, his testimony, paired with forensic evidence, blood, tools, fingerprints, DNA, tape residue, transport vehicle, gave the prosecution a foundation. It wouldn't be the end of the story, but it was enough to move forward. The arrest warrant for Rita Glusman was signed on April 18, 1996. The charge, interstate domestic violence resulting in death, under Title 18, Section 2261 of the United States Code. This would be the first time in American legal history that the Violence Against Women Act was used in a murder case. Now, all that remained was to find her. When a cooperating witness holds the missing pieces, but also has everything to lose. How much of their truth can we trust? By the early morning hours of April 7, 1996, the outline of a homicide was no longer theoretical. Rita Gluzman had crossed a threshold, logistical, psychological, and legal. Yakov Gluzman, 48, had been bludgeoned and dismembered inside their shared River Edge apartment. Now Rita's primary concern shifted, removing any physical trace of the crime. No one could suspect what had taken place behind closed doors, and to achieve that, Rita required precision and assistance. Vladimir Zelenin, her cousin by marriage, had already been drawn deep into the act. Surveillance footage would later confirm that both Rita and Zelenin were seen loading garbage bags into a rented Ford Escort. Those bags, as later confirmed by forensic examination, contained body parts, soaked clothing, and towels heavily stained with Yakov's blood. But in that moment, Rita wasn't acting like a woman horrified by her own actions. She was methodical, focused, more calculating than unhinged. The dismemberment was not clean. Yakov had been struck repeatedly with both a hatchet and a larger axe, tools retrieved from Rita's garage beforehand, which were later recovered and tested positive for the victim's DNA. According to the medical examiner, Yakov sustained at least 10 distinct blunt force and chopping wounds, most of them to the head, neck, and upper torso. Some were post-mortem, others, horrifyingly, were not. The initial blow did not kill him instantly. Blood evidence indicated a struggle had taken place. Blood spatter on the walls, pools soaked into the hallway carpet, arterial spray across the lower cabinets of the kitchen. His body had been dragged post-attack to the bathtub where the dismemberment occurred. Cleanup was neither quick nor professional. Detectives noted that several areas had been hastily wiped, leaving clear smear patterns and partial bloody footprints matching Rita's shoe size. Bleach had been poured in the tub, but the smell lingered. More critically, investigators found Yakov's blood inside a mop bucket and in the washing machine drum, despite both being run with hot water and detergent. What investigators didn't yet have was the body itself. That would come soon enough. Around 4:15 a.m. on April 7th, just hours after the murder, two sanitation workers on routine duty at a Jersey City dumpster behind a local supermarket reported an unusual smell and weight when loading trash bags. They found partial human remains, including limbs, double-wrapped in contractor-grade plastic sheeting secured with duct tape. New Jersey police were called, and within hours the site was swarmed. Rita's name hadn't surfaced yet, but the pieces were assembling faster than she could account for. On April 8th, just one day after the disposal, Vladimir Zelenin made an unplanned visit to the FBI. He was not calm. He claimed fear. And then he spoke, quickly, clearly, perhaps in an effort to save himself. He described Rita's plan, her rage over the divorce, and how she had manipulated him into aiding her. Zelenin admitted he had helped move Yakov's dismembered body in stages, using the rental car Rita had secured under a false name. He claimed he hadn't participated in the killing itself, but the timeline and his proximity told another story. Investigators secured a warrant for Rita's arrest. Within 36 hours, she was apprehended in a New Jersey hotel, attempting to arrange further disposal of remaining body parts that had not yet been dumped. Her demeanor was flat, no struggle, no tears. What stood out most during interrogation was Rita's language. She didn't deny the killing. She denied that it was murder. She referred to it as necessary, a response to betrayal, to humiliation, to abandonment. To her, this wasn't just about a man leaving his wife. It was about erasure, of status, of control, of identity. Rita's worldview had collapsed the moment she realized Yakov no longer feared her. And that, according to investigators, made her more dangerous than any ordinary offender. It was a textbook example of a crime that attempted to erase evidence, but instead left a trail of forensic certainty. By April 10th, all of Yakov's remains had been recovered in 4 separate locations across New York and New Jersey. Each discovery was directly connected to surveillance timestamps and Zelenin's confession. There was no ambiguity left. Rita's fingerprints were on every phase: the planning, the weapon acquisition, the crime scene cleanup, and the body transport. In the end, what brought the truth forward wasn't a single misstep, but a failure of foresight. Rita Gluzman believed meticulous planning and emotional justification would outweigh cold, hard evidence. But blood leaves patterns. Duct tape leaves residue, rental cars leave logs, and accomplices, under pressure, often talk. This chapter marked the complete collapse of the cover-up. A woman once described by neighbors as articulate, elegant, even formidable, was now facing the legal weight of federal homicide charges. Her motive was personal, her method was violent, and her downfall, predictable. The turning point in any homicide investigation is rarely cinematic. It's not about dramatic confessions or hidden diaries. It's about patterns, residue, timelines, and in this case, a faint smear of blood on a basement support beam that shouldn't have been there. By early May 1996, forensic technicians revisited the Hackensack garage where Yakov Gluzman had allegedly been storing old construction tools. Only this time, they were not merely searching, they were reconstructing a crime scene. Underneath a layer of hastily sprayed cleanser on the concrete, luminol revealed what couldn't be washed away: microscopic traces of blood splatter consistent with blunt force trauma. The blood samples, swabbed and sent for DNA testing, were a match to Yakov. The placement of the stains suggested something far more brutal than a sudden confrontation. This was overkill. Repeated strikes likely delivered from above while the victim was either prone or incapacitated. Based on the angle and distance of impact residue, investigators concluded Yakov had been struck multiple times while on the ground. The blood also showed high-velocity spatter, a classic sign of a sharp or heavy weapon swung with intense force. Yet the most chilling detail wasn't chemical, it was mechanical. Tucked under a collapsed cardboard box was the head of a small hatchet. The handle had been deliberately snapped and was never recovered. Forensics matched rust patterns and the spatter trajectory to confirm this was likely one of the murder weapons. This find alone didn't close the case, but it anchored a theory investigators had been quietly forming. Meanwhile, Rita's behavior following Yakov's disappearance had already raised red flags. She repeatedly denied any knowledge of his whereabouts, citing strained communication due to divorce proceedings. But her phone records, cross-referenced against Yakov's last known movements, painted a different picture. On April 6th, the date Yakov was last seen, Rita made multiple calls to her cousin, Vladimir Zelenin, each under 1 minute, and all routed from payphones near her residence in New York. This suggested covert planning, not innocent communication. Authorities brought Zelenin in again. The tone of questioning shifted. This was no longer a missing persons case. It was a homicide inquiry with mounting forensic support. Detectives knew Zelenin was the weak link. He had no prior criminal record, limited understanding of American legal protections, and, most critically, visible discomfort with the escalating investigation. On May 9th, under federal pressure and with prosecutors present, Vladimir Zelenin entered a plea agreement. In exchange for cooperation and testimony, he would avoid the death penalty. His taped confession, recorded over 6 hours, laid out the murder in stark detail. He claimed Rita orchestrated every aspect of the plan, from selecting the weapons to mapping out Yakov's movements. She had convinced him that Yakov was dangerous, abusive, and that his death was the only path to safety and justice. Zelenin stated that on the day of the murder, he lured Yakov to the Hackensack garage under the pretense of helping with storage. Once inside, Rita emerged from a hidden corner with the axe. What followed, he said, was pure chaos. Yakov was struck repeatedly, first by Rita, then by Zelenin when Yakov tried to escape. When Yakov fell unconscious, Rita insisted they continue. She wanted him gone, Zelenin said flatly. The disposal was equally calculated. Rita purchased industrial trash bags, bleach, and plastic wrap days prior. Together, they dismembered the body and scattered remains in separate garbage collection points across state lines, believing this would prevent full recovery and delay identification. The hatchet was meant to be incinerated, but Zelenin admitted he panicked and discarded part of it at the garage. This was the moment the investigation turned. Not only did law enforcement now have a credible confession, but every major point aligned with forensic evidence. Yakov's blood in the garage, the broken hatchet, the bleach trace in Rita's car, and the dismemberment theory from the initial autopsy of recovered remains. Importantly, Zelenin's confession was not a sweeping exoneration of guilt. He admitted full participation and showed remorse, but he emphasized his belief that Rita manipulated him using fear and fabricated abuse claims. Prosecutors noted this carefully. Intent, planning, and leadership, those three elements would later shape the federal charges under VAWA, Violence Against Women Act, as this case tested the scope of that law in reverse. From a forensic standpoint, what stands out is not just the violence, but the preparation. Rita purchased cleaning supplies and tools before Yakov went missing. She created a plausible alibi trail, called from non-traceable lines, and coached her co-conspirator in deception. These details elevated the crime from spontaneous rage to premeditated homicide. By mid-May 1996, Rita Glusman was formally charged in federal court for conspiracy to commit murder, interstate transport of a dismembered body, and violations under the Violence Against Women Act, ironically, the very statute designed to protect victims like the ones she claimed to be. Before we close this chapter, here's something to consider. If the hatchet hadn't been left behind, if just one piece of the plan had worked, would this case have remained a missing persons file? What does it take for premeditation to fall apart? By April 10, 1996, investigators had enough forensic evidence to implicate Rita Glusman: blood spatter, matching plastic bags, microscopic bone traces on an axe. But what they needed was direct testimony. That came from her cousin, Vladimir Zelenin. At first, Zelenin denied involvement, but under pressure in federal custody, his story unraveled. He confessed Rita had lured Yakov to the Yonkers apartment. She struck first with a hatchet. Zelenin arrived later and, under threat from Rita, helped dismember the body. They used household tools. She directed every step. Zelenin's statement aligned precisely with forensic findings: location of blood, cut patterns, transport methods. In exchange for full cooperation, he accepted a plea deal and agreed to testify in court. His confession gave prosecutors what they needed: not just proof of the act, but premeditation. Phone records, plastic bag origin, and surveillance footage all placed Rita at the scene. And because Yakov's remains were dumped across state lines, prosecutors invoked federal jurisdiction using the Violence Against Women Act, VADUA. This was a legal first: a woman charged under VAWA for murdering her spouse. Rita remained silent, refused to cooperate, and pled not guilty. But the case was no longer just about a brutal killing. It had become a landmark legal moment. Behind the headlines, one truth emerged: domestic violence isn't confined to one gender. It's about power. And this time, that power ended in murder. New York, 1997. A courtroom becomes the final stage of a murder born not in chaos, but calculation. In a federal courtroom on the East Coast, one of the most shocking domestic homicide cases of the 1990s reached its final reckoning. The prosecution's case was methodical, anchored in forensic reality, testimony, and the weaponized intimacy of a crumbling marriage. Rita Glusman stood accused not merely of a crime of passion, but of a premeditated execution. The timeline was airtight. The forensic evidence, blood traces, axe fragments, and phone records spoke plainly. And Igor Zelenin, the cousin turned co-conspirator, had turned state's witness. On the stand, Zelenin's voice was quiet, emotionless. He described the moment the first blow fell: the blood, the sound, the silence that followed. In a rare move, federal prosecutors charged Rita under the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, a statute passed in 1994 to combat domestic abuse and gender-based crimes. But here it was used against a woman. This marked legal history. Rita Glusman became the first woman ever convicted under VAWA, not as a victim, but as a perpetrator. Her defense tried to pivot: claims of long-term emotional stress, fears of abandonment, financial ruin. But the jury wasn't moved. The brutality of the killing, the cleanup, the dismemberment, the disposal. These were not acts of desperation. These were calculated, deliberate, and sustained. It took less than a full day for the jury to return the verdict: guilty on all counts. The sentencing was swift. Life in federal prison, no chance of parole. The judge did not speak of vengeance or retribution, only of responsibility and consequence. "You took justice into your own hands," he said. "Now the law takes you." In the months that followed, the case became a legal precedent and a cautionary tale. For prosecutors, it signaled the elasticity and power of the VAWA statute. For lawmakers, it showed how domestic violence laws could be tested in unexpected directions. And for the public, it raised a troubling question: when personal trauma turns into private execution, How do we draw the line between victim and aggressor? Rita would later file multiple appeals from her cell, citing due process and sentencing concerns. None succeeded. As of July 2025, she remains incarcerated, serving a life sentence in federal custody. The legacy of the case isn't confined to a courtroom or a headline. It lives on as a stark reminder: domestic conflict does not always erupt. Sometimes it decays silently until it explodes. And even those who once appeared powerless can become agents of irreversible harm. This case also reminds us of something else, something quieter, that the legal system exists not to assign emotion, but to untangle truth. In a world where narratives are often shaped by who speaks first or loudest, the courtroom remains one of the few spaces where evidence speaks louder. Justice is not always perfect, but in this case, it was unflinching. What this case taught me, what I hope it teaches all of us, is that unresolved resentment is a dangerous silence. When communication breaks down and justice is taken into our own hands, no one wins. Yakov didn't deserve to die. Rita didn't have to become a killer. And yet here we are, left with grief, life sentences, and a haunting lesson on the cost of vengeance. Maybe you've seen warning signs in your own life. Maybe you've known someone stuck in a toxic relationship with no safe way out. If this story resonates, take a moment, reflect, and tell me, what would justice look like before it's too late? If this video moved you, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, what thoughts you have, or even what you disagreed with. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you found this story meaningful, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one.